La siguiente conferencia cuenta con traducción de inglés a español. Para ello deberá ubicarse en la parte inferior de la pantalla y seleccionar el idioma que usted desee escuchar. Para el presente ejemplo, seleccionaremos español. Así también, deberá habilitar la opción Silenciar audio original. Recuerde que también podrá escuchar ambos audios solo si no habilita la opción Silenciar audio original. Podrá escuchar un audio con un 20% de volumen y el otro con un 80% de volumen. Es así como usted podrá escuchar la ponencia en el idioma seleccionado. Bienvenidos.
Bienvenidos al séptimo ciclo de videoconferencias de la Asociación Peruana de Facultades de Medicina. Bienvenidos también en nombre del comité organizador de esta edición de videoconferencias, integrado por la Oficina Panamericana de la Salud, la Red Peruana de Docentes, Investigadores y Entidades Formadoras en Salud Pública y el Observatorio de Sistemas de Salud de la Universidad Nacional Mayor de San Marcos. Esta edición de las videoconferencias de Aspefam está dedicada a un tema de la mayor importancia, a obtener las lecciones aprendidas a 6 meses de la pandemia, lecciones aprendidas para los sistemas de salud y la gobernanza de la salud en el mundo. Este ciclo está integrado por 4 videoconferencias que se llevarán a cabo los días viernes del mes de agosto. En esta oportunidad, 7 de agosto, comenzamos con una visión global, las lecciones aprendidas vistas desde una perspectiva global. Este es el tema de la videoconferencia de hoy. La Asociación Peruana de Facultades de Medicina realiza estas videoconferencias con el objeto de alcanzar al Estado, al gobierno y a la sociedad propuestas que lleven a cabo líneas de trabajo para mejorar el desempeño de nuestro sistema de salud. Para inaugurar el séptimo ciclo de videoconferencias, voy a presentar a nuestras autoridades, tanto de Aspefam como del Ministerio de Salud y la OPS. En primer término, al presidente de la Asociación Peruana de Facultades de Medicina, doctor Miguel Farfán. Sus palabras, por favor.
Buenos días, gracias, doctor Max Cárdenas. A nombre de la Asociación Peruana de Facultades de Medicina, queremos darle la más cálida bienvenida a esta exposición. Nuestro agradecimiento a los expositores, comentaristas, por permitirnos estar vinculados con ustedes y en esta transmisión del conocimiento frente a una pandemia que afecta a todo el mundo y por lo tanto este enfoque global necesita respuestas globales, colaborativas y con el apoyo de todas las autoridades. A nombre de nuestra Asociación Peruana de Facultades de Medicina, nuestro profundo agradecimiento por compartir vuestras experiencias el día de hoy con la academia que está agrupada en la Asociación Peruana de Facultades de Medicina, a nombre del Consejo Directivo, a nombre de los decanos y a nombre de los cerca de 37.000 estudiantes de medicina en el pregrado y cerca de 7.000 en el posgrado, nuestro profundo agradecimiento. Muchísimas gracias, doctor Max Cárdenas.
Gracias a usted, doctor Farfán. A continuación, las palabras del doctor Enrique Gil, en representación de la Oficina Panamericana de la Salud.
Muchas gracias, doctor Cárdenas, por darme la palabra. Estimado doctor Fernando Carbone, en representación de la doctora Pilar Massetti, Estimado doctor Miguel Farfán, presidente de la Asociación Peruana de Facultades de Medicina, estimados colegas y amigos todos, reciban un cordial saludo de parte de la doctora Carissa Etienne, directora de la OPS-OMS, y a nombre del Programa Subregional para América del Sur y de Rubén Mayorga, subcoordinador, que quiero expresar mis saludos y felicitaciones a la Aspefam por organizar este 6º ciclo de videoconferencias, lecciones aprendidas a 6 meses de la pandemia, respuesta de los servicios de salud. 6 meses después de haber declarado la pandemia por COVID-19, el mundo registra cerca de 18.5 millones de infectados y más de 700.000 fallecidos. De un tiempo a esta parte hemos aprendido más sobre la fisiopatología de esta enfermedad, sabemos cómo manejar mejor los casos y tenemos varios ensayos en fase 3 de potenciales vacunas para poder prevenir la infección. Pero también hemos aprendido sobre las mejores estrategias de salud pública que funcionan en esta epidemia. Por eso creemos oportuno hacer un alto en nuestras jornadas cotidianas para reflexionar sobre las experiencias que se han implementado en otros países en la respuesta contra la pandemia y ver qué podemos usar en el contexto nacional y mejorar las políticas públicas. Estoy seguro que luego del ciclo de conferencias de la Aspefam tendrá la posibilidad de contribuir con la sociedad con un conjunto de recomendaciones que serán de gran utilidad en el país, en el cual se empieza a discutir la reforma del sistema de salud. Desde el Programa Subregional para América del Sur de la OPS-OMS, queremos reiterar nuestro saludo y felicitación por esta iniciativa y estaremos atentos a sus conclusiones para poder compartirlas con otros países de la subregión. Muchísimas gracias.
Muy amable, doctor Gil, muchísimas gracias. Invito ahora al doctor Fernando Carbone a hacer uso de la palabra e inaugurar este evento en representación de la señora ministra de Salud, doctora Pilar Macetti. Adelante, doctor Carbone.
A todos y todas en distintas partes del mundo, un saludo a todos, grazie a tutti, greetings at all, Boisenandangalen, Causachum, doctor Cunas, doctora Cunas, Manan Viracochas, Ari Guayquichas, no somos señores, somos hermanos. En nombre de la ministra de Salud, la doctora Pilar Macetti Soler, que ha sido convocada a un Consejo de Ministros extraordinario, un saludo fraterno desde el Perú. Un país que junto con todo el mundo tiene como peor precio de esta pandemia el dolor, el sufrimiento, una inmensa cantidad de compatriotas fallecidos, muchos sufriendo en las UCIs o por la falta de las UCIs, y recordando que esto pudo ser prevenido si en 1978 las palabras de Haldan Mahler y de David Tejada de Rivero hubieran sido más escuchadas y la atención primaria de salud y el primer nivel de atención hubieran sido privilegiados en todos nuestros países dentro de la justicia social, dentro de la seguridad social universal, dentro de la salud para todos. Hay un lema en los países andinos que coincide con lo que el actual director de la OMS señala, él dice que nadie se quede atrás. Nosotros los andinos decimos que todo alcance para todos, que a nadie le falte nada, que nadie se quede atrás, que todos vayamos juntos. Y esa es la gran lección de esta pandemia para el futuro. Ir juntos, nadie atrás, la salud primero, la salud como un compromiso de honor de parte de todos. Saludo esta iniciativa de Aspefam y a su presidente, el doctor Miguel Farfán. Saludo a la OPS que junto con otras organizaciones de carácter mundial está luchando porque la salud regrese a nuestros países, pero saludo sobre todo a todos aquellos en nuestros países que han fallecido cuidando la salud de los demás. Médicos, enfermeras, odontólogos, asistentes sociales, técnicos sanitarios, bomberos, policías, soldados, personal administrativo, que ha entendido, junto con muchos más, que la salud, junto con la vida, son lo más valioso que tenemos. Para construir el Runa, Ayu, Yatra, la persona, la familia, la comunidad saludables, también tenemos un lema que viene desde el imperio incaico. Hukumaya, Huxinhuya, Humaquilla. Una sola fuerza, una sola idea, un solo corazón. Tal vez, si hacemos eso, si la atención primaria y el primer nivel ocupan el espacio que les corresponde, salgamos de esta pandemia con menos dolor y con menos sufrimiento. Los felicito por este evento, les deseo que alcance a mucha gente y que a través de él iniciemos un camino distinto hacia la justicia y hacia la salud. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, doctor Carbone, por sus inspiradas palabras que seguramente serán recogidas por todos los participantes en este evento. Vamos a dar inicio a la primera reunión que, como hemos anticipado, estará dedicada a examinar desde una perspectiva global las lecciones que deja la pandemia para la salud y los sistemas de salud. La primera reunión va a ser moderada por un sanitarista peruano que ha ocupado importantísimas funciones en la Organización Mundial de la Salud, por el doctor Eugenio Villar, quien nos presentará a los distinguidos expositores a los que se ha invitado a tratar este tema. El primero de ellos es un caballero británico muy conocido en el Perú y en el mundo por sus trabajos. Él, haciendo gala de la puntualidad británica, va a empezar su exposición 10:30, pero para introducir los alcances de esta mesa, voy a ceder el uso de la palabra al moderador, el doctor Eugenio Villar, para los preparativos de esta exposición y que nos explique la dinámica en la que se va a llevar a cabo esta primera sesión. Solo antes de trasladarle el uso de la palabra, reitero a quienes se han incorporado que la próxima reunión de este séptimo ciclo se llevará a cabo el 14 de agosto. para tratar las lecciones que deja la pandemia a 6 meses de su a los sistemas de salud europeos. El viernes 21 se tratarán las lecciones que deja la pandemia a los sistemas de salud en las Américas. Y finalmente, el 28 de agosto, tendremos la mesa dedicada a el Perú y las enseñanzas que nos deja como sistema de salud, que son muchas y es deber de todos valorarlas a plenitud para sacar el mayor provecho en aras de una mejora sustancial de nuestro sistema de salud. Dicho esto, cedo la palabra al doctor Eugenio Villar.
Muy buenos días con todos y con todas. Mi nombre es Eugenio Villar. Quería en primer lugar agradecer a Aspefam y el resto de los organizadores por la realización de estos importantes eventos de discusión en el marco de la crisis de la pandemia que azota al mundo y a nuestro país. Vamos a iniciar entonces la primera videoconferencia que aborda el tema de la respuesta global frente a la pandemia. ¿Cuáles han sido las lecciones aprendidas? Para esta videoconferencia voy a explicar la dinámica. Vamos a tener dos ilustres oradores, el doctor Michael Marmot y la doctora Ilona Kickbusch, quienes van a hablar por 30 minutos cada uno, y posteriormente vamos a abrir el tiempo para comentarios y preguntas, y vamos a tener la destacada participación en primera instancia como comentarista al doctor Eduardo Costa de Brasil. Ustedes, audiencia, por favor, si tienen cualquier pregunta o comentario, pueden hacerlas llegar desde el inicio de las presentaciones, poniéndolas en el icono de preguntas y respuestas del Zoom, que está en la parte debajo de su pantalla. Una vez que acaben las presentaciones y el primer comentario del doctor Costa, se va a proceder a la lectura de las principales preguntas y comentarios a fin de que los ponentes, el doctor Marmot y la doctora Kickbusch, tengan luego un tiempo para poder dar respuesta y hacer comentarios a los comentarios de ustedes. Vamos a iniciar entonces la primera de las ponencias. Tengo el honor de presentar al profesor Sir Michael Marmot. El profesor Marmot es profesor de epidemiología en la University College de Londres desde 1985. Es autor de muchos libros y reportes en los campos de desigualdades en salud, siendo su último libro The Health Gap, The Challenges of an Unequal World, que se escribió en 2015. Ha sido y es asesor del director general de la Organización Mundial de la Salud en el tema de los determinantes sociales en la salud. Presidió, como saben todos ustedes, la Comisión de Determinantes Sociales en la Salud de la OMS, pero también ha presidido las comisiones que posteriormente se hicieron en la región de las Américas y en Europa. Ha recibido doctorados honoríficos en 18 universidades, incluyendo en el Perú, en la Universidad Peruana Cayetano Heredia, y ha liderado investigaciones epidemiológicas en desigualdad en la salud en el Reino Unido y en el mundo en los últimos 50 años. El doctor Michael Marmot presidió la British Medical Association y la Asociación Mundial de Medicina, y en el año 2000 la reina de Inglaterra le otorgó el grado de caballero por sus servicios en epidemiología y la comprensión de las inequidades. Profesor Sir Michael Marmot, tiene usted 30 minutos para su presentación.
Thank you. And thank you, Eugenio. When you read out that long list, you forgot to mention that the mayor of Lima gave me a special honor with a medal of the city of Lima at the time that I got an honorary doctorate from Cayetano University. So thank you. You can see my slides? Good. So I'm going to talk about health equity, social determinants of health, and COVID-19. And I know Peru is a long way from the United Kingdom, but I want to use the example of the UK because we have very good data on inequalities, both the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact of the societal response of the lockdown. So forgive me if I use that example. It comes in the context, as I hope you're aware. On the 1st of October last year, we published the report of the Commission of PAHO on equity and inequalities in the Americas, just societies, health equity, and dignified lives. We began with a quote from Nelson Mandela: "Overcoming poverty is not a gesture of charity. It's an act of justice. It's the protection of fundamental human rights, the right to dignity and a decent life." And this was the conceptual framework of the PAHO Commission. For those familiar with the WHO Commission on Social Determinants of Health, this won't look surprising. We have structural drivers, political, social, cultural, and economic structures, the environment, land and climate change, and the history and legacy of ongoing colonialism and structural racism. And then 7 conditions of daily life: early life and education, working life, older people, income and social protection, violence, environment and housing and health systems, and 2 mechanisms of action, governance and human rights. So we had 12 corresponding to 3 here, 7 there, and 2 there, chapters and recommendations. And our approach was one of intersectionality, looking at social and economic inequities, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, disability, and migration. And in case I need to say it again, the opening lines of my book, The Health Gap, were why treat people and send them back to the conditions that made them sick. In other words, important as the health system is, we were focusing on the conditions that made people sick. Now, I said I want to use the example of the UK. In 2010, I was commissioned by the British government after the report of the WHO Commission on Social Determinants of Health. The question they asked was, how could we apply the recommendations of your global commission to one country, England? And I produced a report with 6 recommendations that look pretty much like the ones I've just talked about. And in February this year, on the 25th of February, we published Health Equity in England, the Marmot Review, 10 years on. And I said, I want to use it as a case study. I said, in describing what had happened in the last 10 years, we have lost a decade, and it shows. What do I mean by that? If we look at life expectancy, this is increases in life expectancy at birth for females and for males. I've taken it back in this graph to 1980. If I took it all the way back to 1890, what we would see is that life expectancy improved approximately 1 year every 4 years. In 2010, that changed, and it just about ground to a halt. This really shouldn't happen. We're used to health getting better year on year, and something happened in 2010. Well, we know one of the things that happened was the government changed. We had a conservative-led coalition government that made austerity a priority. And an obvious question is whether those government policies led to this change. The second thing in looking at the health situation in 2020, before the pandemic, is the social gradient in health. Most deprived, least deprived, it's a gradient for males and females. The more deprived the area, the shorter the life expectancy, and that gradient got steeper over the last 10 years. The inequalities got bigger. And it's not just length of life, but quality of life. The top graph is life expectancy. The bottom graph is disability-free life expectancy. And it's a remarkable gradient. The more deprived the area, the shorter the disability-free life expectancy. And the gradient's steeper for disability-free life expectancy than it is for life expectancy. And what that means is that the years spent in poor health were increasing for men and for women. This is not a good situation. And then when we look at regional differences, it's really interesting. This is women I'm looking at, for women in the least deprived 10% of local areas, the regional differences in life expectancy were quite small, and life expectancy was going up. For women in the most deprived 10%, the regional differences were very big, and life expectancy for women in the bottom 10% were going up in London, but were going down in the rest of the country. So this was the situation we found before the pandemic struck. A stalling of the increase in life expectancy, increase in inequalities between levels of deprivation and regions, and for the women in the poorest areas outside London, health getting worse. And to illustrate this further, here we've got London. There's the social gradient by deprivation. I'm still looking at women. And the northeast of the country, if you're in the northeast, the disadvantage of being in a deprived area gets bigger and bigger. So life expectancy for women in London went up, for women in the northeast went down. So now let's look at COVID-19. This was from 1st of March to 17th of April, age adjusted, and by areas of deprivation. The blue is COVID-19 deaths, and the gray is all causes. It's a remarkably similar gradient. There's a bigger impact of COVID-19 in the most deprived areas, and that's very likely related to employment in frontline occupations and to living in multi-generational crowded households. But the fact that the gradient is rather similar for COVID-19 and for all-cause mortality means that to deal with the inequalities in COVID-19, we have to deal with the inequalities in health more generally. Scotland, all-cause mortality by deprivation and COVID-19. Again, very similar picture. And if we look at what we call Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups in England and Wales, Black British, 3 times the mortality from COVID-19 in men, 2.5 times in women. But when adjusted for deprivation, about half of that excess in men can be accounted for by deprivation for Black, and more than half for Bangladeshi or Pakistani. And in women, again, more than half can be attributed to deprivation. And in Bangladeshi or Pakistani women, most of it can be linked to deprivation. And the Indian excess is not as big as Bangladeshi or Pakistani. And again, a substantial fraction of it is deprivation. And some of the extra, just like I showed you, there was an excess of COVID-19 in the more deprived areas, may be related to employment in frontline occupations and living in multi-generational crowded households. So these were the 6 domains of recommendations that I made in my 2010 report. And given what I've said about the causes of inequalities in COVID-19 and the causes of inequalities in health more generally overlapping, I would argue that these 6 are highly relevant right now during the pandemic. Give every child the best start in life, education and lifelong learning, employment and working conditions. Number 4, everyone should have at least the minimum income necessary for a healthy life. Healthy and sustainable places and communities, and taking a social determinants approach to prevention. We didn't say too much about the last one in my 2020 report for this reason. Look at this. There are recommendations in England for people to eat healthily. If people in the bottom 10% of household income followed the healthy eating advice, they would spend 74% of their income on food. What's the point of telling people to eat healthily if they can't afford it? And if they spent 74% of household income on food, who would pay the rent? And if they managed to pay the rent, who would pay for heating of the house? So if you get the other 5 of my recommendations right, the 6th, taking a social determinants approach to prevention, will, in a sense, look after itself. This is from the Food Foundation in the UK. Food insecurity in households with children has nearly doubled since the COVID-19 outbreak. So pre-COVID-19 and during the outbreak, food insecurity doubled. And 2 million children are living in households, 2 million children are food insecure. They're living in households characterized by food insecurity during the pandemic. So to come back to what happened in 2010, that could account for the miserable health picture we had before the pandemic. Well, in 2009-10, public sector expenditure accounted for 42% of gross domestic product. The government had the ambition to roll back the state, and they achieved that ambition. That 42% went down to 35% by 2018-19. And that reduction in public spending was done in a most regressive way. The dark gray here is total spending by local government per person. In the least deprived 20% of areas, local government spending went down by 16%. And then the more deprived the area, the bigger the reduction. So in the most deprived 20%, it went down by 32%. Many of our COVID-19 deaths have occurred in care homes where older people reside. Look at the spending on adult social care. Went down by 3% in the least deprived 20% of areas. And then the greater the deprivation, the greater the reduction. I showed these figures to a WHO economist, and she said, "You're making them up. I've never seen anything quite so neatly regressive as that," she said. The greater the need, the less they spent, the more money they took away. Yep, that's what happened. Is it any surprise that inequalities in health might have increased? And the government's strategy, they said, was to get the economy back on a firm footing. Well, it didn't work. This is wage growth for the rich countries between 2007 and 2018. The UK had negative wage growth. The only rich countries, OECD countries, that did worse were Mexico and Greece. And then Portugal and Italy had negative growth, and all the other countries had positive growth. So we had this rigorous austerity in the name of good economy. We didn't get a good economy, and we did real damage. So look at children living in poverty before and after housing costs. Housing costs make a big difference. Poverty is defined as less than 60% median income. So before housing costs in 2010-11, about 18% of children in poverty. After housing costs, it was 27%. So let's look at after housing costs. It went from 27% to 30%. Child poverty went up. And if we look at household type, this is a lone parent not working. In 2010, about 61% of children in families headed by a lone parent not working were in poverty. And by 2017-18, that 61 had gone up to 70%. Work was supposed to be the way out of poverty. So let's look at a lone parent in full-time work. In 2010, about 18% of children were in poverty. By 2017-18, 30% of children were in poverty. Being in full-time work was not the way out of poverty. They were lowly paid. I've got good news. We're working with Greater Manchester. They call themselves a Marmot region. And children eligible for free school meals are the poorest children. And in terms of early child development, they do poorly compared with the English average. And in Greater Manchester, these children eligible for free school meals, low-income pupils, were doing worse than the English average. And Greater Manchester said, that's no good. We can do better than that. So they did. From 2015-16 to 2018-19, they closed the gap. The poor kids in Greater Manchester are now doing as well as the English average. I said that work was not the way out of poverty. The number of workers in poverty increased. And if we look at the changes the Minister of Finance, the Chancellor of the Exchequer as we call him, made to the tax and benefit system in 2015. Look at working age families with children by deciles of income. If you were in a working age family with children, as a result of the changes made by the Minister of Finance, income would have gone down by more than 15%. If you were in the second bottom decile, went down by 12%, and then the richer you were, the less the reduction in income. I sat with a junior minister, former minister in this government. I showed him a version of this graph and said, your government's policy was to make poor people poorer. And he looked uncomfortable. He said, well, maybe that wasn't our explicit policy. I said, there are very clever people in Her Majesty's Treasury. You must have known that that was the effect of the policies. And I can't resist this. This is income decile. Our Office for National Statistics calculates income in different ways. So original income is the income you get in the market. And if you look at tax, both direct and indirect tax, so indirect tax is value-added tax, sales tax and the like, that People in the bottom 10% of income, original income, pay 90% of their income in tax. People in the top 10% pay 35% of their income in tax. My goodness. Well, now let's look at gross income. Gross income is income you get in the market plus benefits. Okay, maybe that's a better way to do it. So people in the bottom 10% pay about 45% of their income in tax, and people in the top 10% pay 35% of their income in tax. I'm no economist, but I don't think that's very fair, that poorer people should pay a higher proportion of their income in tax than richer people. Housing, a measure of problems with affordability of housing, is spending more than 1/3 of income on housing. And not surprisingly, the more deprived people are, the more likely they are to spend more than 1/3 of their income on housing. And that percent has gone up. So if they're spending more than 1/3 of their income on housing, and they've got to spend 74% of their income to eat healthily, that's 104% of income or more. As I said, who's going to pay for domestic heating or buy children new shoes? And partly as a result of housing supply and affordability, the number of households in temporary accommodation went up. And the estimated number of people sleeping rough in England tripled since the publication of the Marmot review in 2010. Because of cuts to local government, all sorts of services got cut. So counselling services for young people, for teenagers, helping young people stay out of mischief, got cut. Services to young children got cut. Educational maintenance allowance to encourage poorer youngsters to stay in school got cut. And guess what happened? Violence went up. Level of deprivation, the more deprived the area, the greater the violence. And there was a clear increase in violence. People wringing their hands saying, my goodness, what's going on? How can we deal with knife crime? Well, the way you could deal with knife crime is focusing on good early child development, keeping young people in school, creating counseling services. Air pollution, PM10 concentration, the more deprived the quintile, the higher the PM10 and PM2.5 concentration in every English city. And I'm showing this because I want to make a point. We have made the point in several of the reports with which I've been involved that we need to bring the health equity agenda and dealing with the climate crisis together. So, for example, in our 2020 report, we said 100% of new housing should be carbon neutral by 2030, with an increased proportion being either affordable or in the social housing sector. An aim for net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, ensuring inequalities do not widen as a result. Now, I've spent time looking in England. I've got these figures available and related to my report. This is a rich country. If we can do this in a rich country, if we can be so insensitive to the damage that policies are doing to the health of the population, my goodness, what would a middle-income country or a low-income country do? As we come out of this pandemic, I think we need a wholly different approach. A well-being approach can be described as enabling people to have the capabilities they need to live lives of purpose, balance, and meaning for them. Where might I have got that quote from? Amartya Sen? Yeah, possibly. But no, it was actually the New Zealand Ministry of Finance. They said, not let's put growth of gross domestic product at the center of our economic policy. This was 2019, before the pandemic. Let's put well-being at the center. A well-being approach can be described as enabling people to have the capabilities they need to live lives of purpose, balance, and meaning for them. I think it's vital that we draw the lessons. If a rich country can do such damage, so can any other country. We need to be monitoring the inequality impact of social policies, as well as the pandemic and the societal response to the pandemic. And as we build back better, we need to put sustainability and health equity together and take a well-being approach to our economy. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, profesor Marmot, por su excelente exposición. Vamos a proceder a la segunda ponencia a cargo de la profesora Ilona Kickbusch. La profesora Ilona Kickbusch, quien ya es conocida también en el Perú, fue fundadora y jefa del Centro de Salud Global del Instituto de Estudios Internacionales y Desarrollo en Ginebra. La doctora Kickbusch es una destacadísima profesional en los campos de diplomacia de la salud y gobernanza global. Entre otros logros, se le considera la madre de la Carta de Ottawa, de la promoción de la salud, porque jugó un rol fundamental en esa famosa conferencia que dio origen al concepto moderno de promoción de la salud. La profesora Kickbusch integra comisiones de alto nivel a nivel global en la Organización Mundial de la Salud y en otras, en diversos temas relacionados a la gobernanza global y a las enfermedades no transmisibles. Lidera el Consejo de la Cumbre Mundial de la Salud, con sede en Berlín. La profesora Kickbusch ha sido directora de promoción de la salud en la OMS y de la División de Salud Global en la Universidad de Yale, los Estados Unidos. Ella recibió la Cruz de la Orden de Mérito de su país, la República Federal Alemana, en los campos de diplomacia de la salud y gobernanza global en salud. Profesora Kickbusch, tiene 30 minutos para su ponencia. Gracias.
Yes. So thank you, Eugenio. Thank you all. I'm delighted to be with you. And as you know, I have a very special relationship to Peru because my daughter-in-law is Peruvian. And maybe if you look closely, you can see behind me two small Peruvian protectors that I have here in my study. I would ask the colleagues to please put up my PowerPoints if they can, and then we can start with the lecture. I will wait for that. Lucy, can we share the PowerPoint? Eugenio, can you check what is happening? Okay, thank you very much. So thank you very much. I've been asked to speak to you about global governance for health in the times of Corona. And I will look at various aspects of governance that are critical. So if we move to the first slide, please. Obviously, as we look at these various issues of governance, while I speak of a whole range of issues that are both global, regional, and national, they are of high importance also for Peru. You know the figures better than I do. These are figures from yesterday. You've been through 145 days of emergency now. And of course, the very close linkage to what Michael has also presented is that we are not only seeing a disease, we are seeing a significant increase in poverty in Peru and in most countries of the world following the outbreak of the disease on the one hand, and following the measures taken to fight the disease. And I will refer to some of those things as well. If we go to the next slide, you can see a comparison of what happens in a world with health security and a world without health security. And again, Michael has referred to the issue of a world where we actually put well-being very much in the focus, and where we ensure people's livelihood and quality of life and people's happiness. Therefore, I think we do have to be much more focused also on issues of health security. I'm very aware that many colleagues also at times are skeptical about the notion of health security. They worry that health security takes away resources from building primary health care, from building universal health coverage, from building public health. But if we use a modern concept of health security, which is similar to the concept of social security, it is actually a very basic responsibility of each and every society, and particularly of the global community as a whole, to protect populations from disease outbreaks and the consequences that they bring. And anybody you would speak to in the international arena, even though we had warned, and I'm a member of the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, we had warned of such a global pandemic and of its potential impact. The brutality and the expanse of that impact is something that nearly nobody really expected. And therefore, we do have to include this notion of health security as being deeply linked to social security, to stability, and to well-being in a very new way in our thinking. If we go to the next slide and look at the issues and the challenges that we face in governance, if we look at COVID-19, could we have the next slide, please? Who's doing this? Thank you. Some of you who know my work, no, please go back, will know that we are thinking of three spaces of governance that we have to look at. Yes. One is the space where decisions need to be taken, in particular in relation to health. The health organizations like the World Health Organization, but also, and this is something that COVID-19 has clearly shown, we need to have a much clearer focus on what we have called global governance for health, and that is the activities in the many other global organizations, in the development banks, etc., that I will come back to. And it is many of these other organizations, to come back to some of the points that Michael made, that actually address the economic, the social, the commercial, and the political determinants of health. And if they don't do their job, it's actually the health organizations that have to do a lot of the mop up, if I can call it that. And then, of course, we have the governance for global health, where the national and regional levels work in support of the health agenda or in fulfilling the commitments that they have towards global health security. So I will, in the lecture, refer to these three spaces of governance. But before I do that in more detail, I want to leave two main messages with you about what we are experiencing around the COVID-19. If we go to the next slide, you can see message one. And message one is clearly that what we are experiencing now with COVID-19 is first and foremost a governance failure. And I think everything we heard from Michael also refers to governance failures. Governance failures in terms of what government, what the state, what institutions do for their people, and how they manage the state, the welfare state, social security, health security, and many of the other areas. And we can see clearly as we look at COVID-19 and its impact that in all three spheres and spaces of governance that I have just introduced to you, there was failure. There was big failure that failed the world and its people at all three levels. If I go to the next message that I would like to leave with you, the second message, if we can have the next slide, that is that we see clearly, and I will come back to that in a minute, is that governance at all levels, national, regional, and global, is a neglected dimension of health security, is a neglected dimension of preparedness and response. And that is why I have quite consciously put a picture here of an empty executive boardroom of the WHO in order to symbolize the lack and the neglect that we see of governance in preparedness and response. Actually, if we first look at the world, we have an institutional frame. And there are two key dimensions of this institutional frame. Of course, we have a global organization. We have the World Health Organization, governed by 194 member states. And within that organization, we have a strong emergency program that was established about 4 years ago. But if you look more closely, and that is summarized on the next slide, you can see clearly that this global organization suffers from a lack of political support, from a lack of funding, both regular funding and in times of emergencies. Could we have the next slide, please? And from a lack of authority to really be able to negotiate with the member states, and a lack of investigatory independence. This organization cannot just go to a country and say, we would like to explore your state of preparedness, or we would like to explore whether you have adhered to the international health regulations. So this is a very dire situation, and because of this situation, there has been constant and severe criticism of the WHO and of its leadership. You can see the Director General, Dr. Tedros, here. But if you look closely, and I would like to encourage you to really look at the next slide that I have put together, because it shows you what, despite this situation of lack of political support and lack of financial support that organization has been able to do in the last 6 months. It has provided an enormous amount of guidance and technical advice to countries, but not all countries have followed that. It has brought together scientists from all over the world to work on these recommendations. It has started solidarity trials for therapeutics around the world. It has trained 4 million people around the world in response to COVID-19. It has started solidarity flights, bringing materials for COVID-19 like PPE to the poorest countries. It has created a totally new governance system called ACTA, which is an accelerator to develop therapeutics, diagnostics, and vaccines. And within that, a new institution called COVAX to ensure that vaccines are sent when they are developed to all countries. I will come back to that. They have initiated a technology pooling initiative, which actually came out of Latin America. Costa Rica was one of the first countries to propose that, and actually Peru was one of the first countries to support it. It's also done some very new things, like take action against the infodemics and the conspiracy theories around COVID-19, and hoping to help the weakest countries. It has created a whole number of fundraising initiatives. One is the Solidarity Response Fund, and the other are other mechanisms from member states and donors, where WHO has been able to raise about 1 billion to be able to respond. So you can see that here is a weak organization that actually, because it's working day in, day out, can do all this. Just imagine if this organization had the full support, had the full finance, and was strong, what it could do. One of the key initiatives that will be important for all countries, and of course also Peru, is this initiative that is called COVAX, that tries to bring countries and other actors together to not only move forward in finding a vaccine, but also already now working on how to produce the vaccine, how to make sure it is distributed fairly around the world and can reach the poorest and middle income countries. Talking more about COVAX would be, a whole lecture in itself, but you can see the kind of initiatives that are happening at the global level, that if they work and if countries work together and other institutions support the WHO, will benefit each and every country. As the Director General says, no one will be safe until we are all safe. And that is why everybody should have access to a vaccine. If we move on with the institutional frame just very quickly, because it is very much in the focus of many people's understanding, we don't only have an organization, we have a legally binding global instrument, the International Health Regulations. This is the primary international governance instrument for health emergencies. But again, if we look at it closely, and if we look at the next slide, we can see a whole number of gaps that are actually there, because countries, many countries and many rich countries also, are not implementing and are not complying with the international health regulations. So the state parties do not fill their obligations at the national level and not in relation to global collective action. They are not transparent, they do not report accordingly, they don't declare pandemics when they should, they are not willing to share samples, they are not willing to support weaker nations, and particularly around COVID-19. we have seen new problems emerge around trade, think of supply chains, and around travel recommendations. And the countries do not invest sufficiently in research and developments. If we go to the next slide, which shows you the global governance for health that I mentioned, and the political bodies and the political clubs and finance institutions that are actually responsible for that, you can see that the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the development banks, the UN Security Council, and the World Trade Organization have not responded in the way that they should. One of the key issues at stake here is debt relief. Debt relief for the poorest countries in the face of COVID-19. There are some initiatives that there can be a delay in repaying debts from the poorest countries, but there is great hesitancy. Interestingly enough, in a parallel multilateral system where the Asian Investment Bank is working, China is suggesting to actually make sure that the poorest countries do not have to pay back their debts to the Asian Investment Bank. But you can see here that all these organizations, and I consciously put them here, please stay there, as being so separate. Please go back to the last slide. That they do not intersect to the extent that they should. Each of them acts in a fragmented manner. Many of them are in a political stalemate because the United States is no longer playing the multilateral game. There is not enough investment in poverty reduction, and all of them were not prepared for the unprecedented impact on the economics and on trade of COVID-19, and they are still clamoring to be able to respond and to make enough resources available. So if we then look at the national and the regional level, you can see that initially there has been an assessment of the governance capacity of countries to respond to a pandemic, their level of preparedness. So if you go to the next slide, yes, you can see that most countries, and I'd urge you to look at the Global Health Security Index, that the majority of countries, I'm sorry, please could we go back to the slide? I don't know who's jumping that way. Please, can we go back to the previous slide? Thank you very much. That most countries showed a significant lack of preparedness. Now, if you look at this bubble that you have there with the countries, you see an astounding thing. You see that the two countries that were evaluated best in the Global Health Security Index were the United States and the United Kingdom. Now, if you look at the figures on COVID-19, you see clearly that there is a big discrepancy between the assessed and the actual preparedness, a very, very big discrepancy. Because if you look at the two countries that actually are bearing the brunt of the pandemic right now, as India, as some Latin American countries, and as Africa is catching up, they are actually the two countries that were considered to be best prepared. And what we can see here is that it has made clear that there are weaknesses in societies, health systems, and social cohesion, but particularly weaknesses in politics and political decision-making, that even if you have good institutions, if they are not governed well, and if the political powers that be do not listen to these institutions, then of course you will get the impacts that you have. And you have heard from Michael how, because other parts of the country, not only, the global health security preparedness, but actually how strong your welfare state is, how strong your health system is. If this is not seen together, then what you will get is a significant impact on the poorest people. And you have, of course, seen that in Peru. You have seen the level of unemployment rise. You've seen it in tourism. You've seen it particularly in the small businesses that have no support. And of course, because you have a very high level of informal economy, which constitutes about 70% of Peruvian GDP, if that is not considered within the whole package of the country's response, then of course you will find that the virus multiplies within those groups that are particularly vulnerable and that have no choice to protect themselves, whether there is a lockdown or not. So to slowly round up what we are learning from these governance weaknesses, if we now go to the last slide, we can see that in countries where equity is low, where transparency is low, where there is little political accountability, where there is little participation of people or of other levels of governance, and where the rule of law is not being adhered to, there we can see a particularly strong impact of COVID-19. So that in general, if we go back to that slide, please, we can see that there are two key issues that are absolutely critical in terms of a global perspective, that there is global adherence to the rule of law, and in this case it would be the international health regulations, and there is a global commitment to international solidarity, which would be a commitment to multilateralism. Because the global health security system, as I have written here, relies on actors fulfilling their obligations under international agreements. And this is not happening with COVID-19 now. Particularly, and now we can go to the next slide, which is just a time frame since December of last year, the evolution of the COVID-19 outbreak, and you can look at it again and you see below the spread in various parts of the world, that one of the things we have seen, which has been a tragedy in itself, is the failure to act by much of what we now call the global north or the Western countries. And that we've had, a sort of colonial mind frame in global health security, that when a pandemic comes along, it happens in the poor countries and it doesn't affect us. And some people have called that magical thinking, and the exceptionalism that some countries, particularly like the United States and the United Kingdom, have felt as if they were immune from viruses that are global and that cross borders. That leads me to my two last points. If we can have the next slide. We have seen that one of the reasons that the world has been so hard hit by this virus has been politics in the widest sense of the word, and has particularly been geopolitics. It's been partly because the two big powers, the United States and China, are no longer able to work with one another. And that has destroyed a lot of multilateral cooperation, particularly within the World Health Organization, but has also led to a stalemate in the G20, in the UN Security Council, in all those bodies that I have shown you. The United States has not even adopted resolutions if it's included the name of the virus as COVID or Corona. It always wanted to speak of the China or the Wuhan virus, just to give you an example. It did not accept resolutions in the Security Council if they referred to the World Health Organization. So we can see that a decline of multilateralism makes us all unsafe, that this geopolitics is a threat to the health safety of people all around the world, each and every one of us. The other dimension of politics that we have seen, and you will recognize some of the gentlemen on this slide, is that we have seen in many cases a particular rise of the disease and a particular spread of the virus in countries that have populist leadership. That is not exclusively so, but we see it in many high-income and many middle-income countries. And this is a very disconcerting political determinant of health and of governance that we need to analyze and that we need to look at more clearly. It's most clearly expressed, as my next slide shows, in what we now call vaccine nationalism. Many of the countries that are here on this slide as well have no interest to join COVAX. They do not want to be part of an international solidarity where the vaccine is shared as a common good. They have taken the approach, we will buy what we can get, we will do it first, and we will put our population first. And we do not quite know yet what kind of impact such vaccine nationalism is going to have. So to end, I come to my very last slide. Where are we actually at? I think we are subjected to the greatest test of multilateralism. And I think we can see that without solidarity and cooperation with global governance institutions, we all suffer. Working together globally makes a difference for each and every country. So we now have a political governance challenge. We need to re-establish the global norms of solidarity, multilateral cooperation, good governance, remember the 5 components I mentioned, and trust. And here we can see that we cannot rely on the so-called big powers. And there is a very important role now of middle powers, of middle countries and small countries who have an interest in multilateralism, who have an interest in good governance, and are willing to move this agenda forward. I think over the next 6 months, we will be confronted as never before with political dimensions of a virus. I call it the politvirus. And unless we're able to resolve some of these political issues, we are going to continue to see issues of equity and devastation. Because point one, if we don't work together on health, we're not going to work together on any of the social and economic determinants that Michael has spoken about. And we're going to let the middle income and low income countries fall deeply into debt and poverty again, and any progress we might have made for the Sustainable Development Goals will be lost. Thank you very much.
Gracias, profesora Kickbusch, por su excelente presentación, muy inspiradora, como la presentación de Michael también. Vamos a tratar de dar el máximo de tiempo posible ahora para los comentarios y las preguntas de la audiencia, que es bastante grande. Por ello, por favor, les pediría a todos aquellos quienes quieren hacer un comentario o una pregunta, que por favor la pongan en el icono de preguntas y respuestas del Zoom, que está en la base de la pantalla. Desde ya estamos recibiendo esos comentarios y preguntas. Vamos a proceder entonces ahora al primer comentario, que lo va a hacer el profesor Eduardo Costa. El profesor Eduardo Costa es doctor en Salud Pública de la Universidad Federal de Río y de la Universidad de Londres. Es un destacado profesor de epidemiología de la Escuela Nacional de Salud Pública de la Fundación Fiocruz en el Brasil. El doctor Costa fue secretario de Salud, de Higiene y también de Ciencia y Tecnología del Estado de Río de Janeiro en Brasil y es miembro de la Red Latinoamericana de las Escuelas de Salud Pública. Profesor Eduardo Costa, tiene usted 15 minutos para sus comentarios en relación a las dos ponencias hechas. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to compliment all the participants, of this webinar, and state that I'm very pleased to be here representing the School of Public Health of Rio de Janeiro, Fiocruz, on behalf of Hermano Castro, his director. I'm also pleased to see and meet here friends from our RESP, that is the Latin American Association of Schools of Public Health, especially the group from Peru, like Gustavo, Pedro Rega, and muchos otros. Of course, I would have to accept such invitation for all that it represents, but also having making the main presentations, someone like Ilona, and very much especially my old friend and colleague, Michael Marmot. So what was thinking here while they are speaking and making their presentation was basically in two lines. The first one, taking the idea that has been proposed by the seminar. What are the lessons learned? What are the lessons learned? One, in respect to equity. And other, I would say more generally, about the capabilities of our systems to intervene in a pandemic like this one that we're living now. One point that is very interesting in my view as an epidemiologist, that maybe the main lesson that you can take up to now from this period of pandemic, you would say this basic recover of something that had been thrown out in epidemiology. We went up to some models in which no any single sort of element that could deal with poverty or any other characteristics of the population that could be important to implement any policy had been taken into account. The second point is that, on the other hand, we had a full hand of new ethics and new ways of doing old things that were working perfectly. Let's see one that I would like to stress that has not been talking about up to now, the role of China. A new ethics started when China decided to very quickly, after they could open the genome of the coronavirus 2, or novel coronavirus, to send it to all the countries, all the laboratories of the world. Immediately. That was on the 10th of January, giving time to the people to prepare themselves. The other point of this ethics was to open its doors to all researchers, and especially to WHO, to go inside and look with their eyes all that they were doing there. And that was the beginning, not only the epidemics or the pandemics, it was the beginning of a new way of dealing with health in this new world that we live. Coming to the end, they decided when they opened the 73rd Assembly, World Assembly, to declare that their vaccines, any of them, would be a global good. And different from other countries, instead of taking out money of the WHO, they decided to increase their support. Now, this is very different from what happened 100 years ago when we had the pandemic of Spanish flu, when everything was in fact hidden. People were at war, and the secrecy and all these sort of things are the basic of everything. And in fact, although in a different way, we are in a war. And this war came clear when some of the governors of the world, the presidents, and act in dispute, not of a better living for everybody, but to keep power, economic power. Well, I think it's the main point of the series. It's a lesson that we can have another way of acting in health. And you have to take this opportunity. Apart from this first point, I would say that I had some figures and graphics to take, but I thought by the type of intervention was making wouldn't be necessary. But just to say that I keep looking, especially at the data from Latin America. And it strikes me the difference, huge difference in attack rates, in mortality, in different countries of Latin America with, say, some similar background, similar problems. Some of them doing very well, dealing with the situation very well. I would mention only one, although all the people would like the second one too, I'll mention the second second one, but Uruguay and Cuba. Very different from one point, for a different sort of government, very different sort of health system, and very successful. And then we have the situations of Brazil and Peru, for instance, the most badly affected countries of Latin America. Is the brotherhood not very good at this moment? And you keep, in fact, not looking deeply, I would say, with epidemiological easy tools to understand how it happens. We keep trying to follow what WHO says. What the easiest and so broadest way of talking to everybody, we need to be very broad speaking. And so our social distance, social isolation. And they have, again, I would say, thrown out all epidemiological development that we had, especially after smallpox eradication campaign, when it became clear that we could only do such sort of work based on surveillance, field action, workers, simple workers in the front, investigating, promoting, in the case, vaccine, but now in this case, isolation and conditions to the people. So, if I say, then one of the main lessons was this one. I've mentioned one, the other one now, about the way that you could deal with our human resource, and you didn't do it. I think that many people would be surprised that here in Brazil, that we say always that you had a very good, or at least sometimes thought very good health system, and broad, I would say almost an army of health workers, the field health workers that we call agents of public health, and they were not used. It's an army. In Brazil, we had almost 300,000 health workers with the activity of visiting homes, and they didn't go to do it. Of course, it's very easy to explain why. I could say some reasons for that. But what it shows is that we needed really a strong unity, a commandment, and health authority with real authority to get things running well. All our facing this epidemic in Brazil was almost everything based on hospitals, hospitalization of severe case. And the result was the spreading everywhere. We spent a lot of money in hospitals. You couldn't change really the prognostic of the people that went to the hospital. Not very much. But we did not do a single measure to see people at their homes, at their work. It's very interesting, commenting one point of that Michael Marmot has presented, that to understand inequalities in this case, we need to understand what was the fallacy of the social isolation. When only the middle classes, the people that had good conditions, are staying at home and want to stay more and more at home. And the workers had no chance for that. It's not really at that point that they have to get the food to eat. It's more than that. They are obliged to work because they're the essential service. It's not only because they don't have good housing, no, because they are obliged to work so that you can eat. So essential services were completely out of view of our health system, including the health workers. While in China, we had that affected people dealing with the case, affected people and health workers dealing with the case had the same attack rates of the population. It means that they were protected. No, in Brazil, that's not true. Health workers are dying more than other groups, and no provision of a good system of preventing them to get the disease is put into place. Being a country very large, you know, and this project of exportation that you have in basic goods like commodities and the meat and everything. So the area that is linked to exportation continued working everywhere. And again, no even one test to see if they are ill or not ill. Well, so I wanted to summarize that I would say then that in this case, the inequality is simply exposure to the risk, accepted by society as normal, as something that is there to make the social isolation. We need, of course, to have food, someone to bring it at our homes. And this in a country that you know that is the second country most concentrated with the income most concentrated with the world. Are two countries in this country. And a very narrow space for everybody. 1% of the population here gains the same as 28% more poor in terms of income. So I would just finish saying that we have now a new challenge. We have a challenge in Latin America to understand why the difference between us, among all us, which I believe is based only in epidemiological surveillance, if it's active or inactive. It seems to me that that's the simplest thing that could be done, and they had no stress. Sorry, I'm not attacking the WHO, but it was very late. WHO first talked about isolation, and 2 months after in tracking and in active search. And in fact, that was the key in China and in Asia. The key instrument to control disease in these countries was this one. And also in Uruguay, and also in Cuba. I have
Por favor,
one minute.
profesor Costa, ¿podría ir cerrando para poder dar paso a la audiencia? Muchas gracias.
Okay, I didn't hear anything, but I agree. And the point is, just to finish, could finish. Oh, when? Just to say then that we have now one final challenge that's more global than this one, is really to assure that the COVAX effort brings a way of dealing with the vaccine that we are really believing that is going to happen soon, in a year time. But we need to work much more before it. As I say, in Brazil, we have 1,000 deaths on average by day by COVID-19. And it means that 300 days are another 300,000 lives that will die. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, profesor Costa, por sus importantes observaciones en sus comentarios. Vamos a pasar rápidamente entonces ahora a tener unos 15 a 20 minutos para preguntas y comentarios. Y para ello le vamos a pedir a la doctora Lucy López, quien gentilmente ha venido agrupando las preguntas y comentarios para que las lea, y luego daremos 5 minutos al doctor Michael Marmot y 5 minutos a la doctora Kickbusch para que hagan sus comentarios sobre ellas. Si hubiera un poco más de tiempo, podríamos pasar quizás a una segunda rueda. Muchas gracias. Lucy López, por favor, tienes la palabra. Lucy.
Ok, yo creo que ahora sí. Disculpe. Gracias, doctor Villar. Acá tenemos una primera pregunta del doctor José Garay, y él dice que consideraría al doctor Marmot que parte de esta década perdida también se debe a un exceso de confianza en los centros de atención hospitalaria por parte de los gobiernos y en una falta de apoyo para aprovechar las oportunidades para investigar los problemas de salud, con la finalidad de encontrar elementos que nos permitirían mejorar sus desempeños. El doctor Garay también tiene otra pregunta y se refiere a si el sistema y la investigación, ¿considera que la investigación podría ser beneficiosa para la toma de decisiones con el fin de mejorar la gobernanza y el desempeño del sistema? Hay otra pregunta relacionada para ambos ponentes, y es, teniendo en cuenta la importancia de la participación comunitaria, ¿qué intervenciones eficaces conoce o pueden haber para movilizar y colaborar con los gobiernos distritales para fortalecer los determinantes sociales y la gobernanza en sus poblaciones? También hay una pregunta que ¿cuáles pueden ser los criterios para evaluar la seguridad en salud en una condición, o cuáles serían las modificaciones de los criterios de evaluación de seguridad en salud después del COVID? Hay una otra pregunta, por favor, dice, del doctor Augusto Tarazona, en el Perú se tiene un gran sector económico informal, 70%. Implica que tienen necesidad de trabajar para su subsistencia. De otro lado, se ha incrementado la transmisión del virus del COVID. ¿Es posible la coexistencia de medidas económicas como reapertura económica con las medidas sanitarias para la contención de la epidemia. Beatriz Nascimento de Fiocruz. Doctor Kickbusch, en su opinión, ¿qué rol puede tener la integración regional de los países y los organismos de América Latina como Mercosur, la Comunidad Andina, etcétera, para controlar o aportar al control de la pandemia? Y finalmente, una pregunta que hemos seleccionado en este bloque es el doctor Pedro Marchena Reategui, y él dice: si bien la pandemia nos muestra el efecto de las brechas entre los grupos poblacionales de un país y entre las regiones del mundo, realmente, ¿qué haría que los gobiernos nacionales en ejercicio realicen los cambios en el discurso político, social, sanitario, de política económica para asegurar la equidad? No obviamente solo el discurso, sino la real implementación de nuevas políticas.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, Lucy, por la síntesis. Daríamos entonces 5 minutos, comenzando quizás ahora por la doctora Kickbusch, y luego 5 minutos al profesor Michael Marmot. Y con ello yo creo que estaríamos dando ya los comentarios finales para el cierre. Doctora Kickbusch, por favor.
Thank you. Let me talk a bit about the UK again as an example. And I think it's an interesting example because if you look, the Economist Intelligence Unit ranks countries on the strength of their democracy from 1, Norway, to 168, North Korea. And it ranks 22 countries as having a full democracy. Remarkably, the UK is still among them. So we have, according to the Economist Intelligence Unit, a fully functioning democracy. I should add, the United States ranks 25 as a flawed democracy. But we have a fully functioning democracy. And we came into this pandemic woefully unprepared. Woefully unprepared. There was a general mistrust of scientific expertise. There was a general mistrust of government, by the government. That's a remarkable situation. The government mistrusted the government. No wonder the rest of us didn't trust the government. So there was, and there was a persistence of this defunct ideology about austerity and belief in the market. So that's how we came into the pandemic. And then we had, as Ilona said, a prime minister of populist leanings who tried to, he said, forgive me using the English idiom, we should take it on the chin. In other words, let the pandemic wash across the population and then we'll be all right. He said, he boasted that he went into hospitals and shook hands with everybody. A few calculations said, if we took it on the chin, if 80% of the population got infected, that could be 400,000 deaths. Eduardo talked about 300,000 deaths in Brazil by the end of the year, in 300 days. We could have had 400,000 deaths. But it was pointed out to the government that taking it on the chin and having 400,000 deaths was perhaps not what we expected of government. So then, rather too late, they locked down. Rather too late, having dithered. Germany, for example, did it earlier. We did it late. We started with testing and then scrapped it. Dr. Tedros said, test, test, test. The clear advice from WHO was test, test, test. Our government knew better. They scrapped the testing. The advice was, if you have symptoms, stay home, self-isolate, and don't get tested. So we didn't even know the magnitude of the pandemic. I think we did everything wrong. If you laid out what you needed to do, we did everything wrong. It was a case study for how not to govern. in the face of an emergency. So when you ask about overconfidence, yeah, I think there was overconfidence. And what we had was a government that didn't know how to govern, unfortunately, and that was overconfident. We looked at the Prime Minister of the Netherlands explaining to the population this was a problem, these were the dimensions of the problem, this is why the Dutch population needed to behave in a certain way. We watched the Chancellor in Germany, Angela Merkel, do similar things. It might have helped that she had a scientific background, but explaining in a clear way what was needed to be done. So we did everything wrong. And suddenly, the government, in opposition to what it had said in 2010, instead of saying we must have austerity, they said, whatever it takes, we'll spend whatever it takes. Okay, they could have said that 10 years ago, but good. And then they said, we're only following the science. It was a bit late for that, but still, there was a belated recognition of three things. The state was important, the science was important, and that when you've got a national emergency, it's not the time to be thinking about debt. That those orthodoxies had to change. And a huge question is what happens as we come out of the pandemic? Will we have learned lessons? And I've been asked many times, are you optimistic? And as a Brazilian colleague once said to me, when I said I was an evidence-based optimist, he said, no, you're not optimistic, you're hopeful. Ah, okay. I don't believe it'll get better. I'm hopeful that it will get better, that we'll learn some lessons. Now, in relation to the question about people in the informal sector, what we've seen with the lockdown is that it has increased inequalities quite markedly. High-income people can work from home. They can't go out and spend money. So the sectors in which they would have spent money, like retail, hospitality, entertainment, the people who work in those sectors have either lost their jobs or been furloughed, so their income has gone down, and rich people are saving money because they can't spend it. So inequalities in income and wealth have increased, and people in the informal sector are right at the front line. As one of your questioners said, you either work or you starve. And it might be that you either work and you get sick and then starve. And I've been arguing strongly that we need to put, as I said at the end of my presentation, we need to put well-being of the population, and as Eduardo said, equity for the population at the heart of how we cope with the continued pandemic and how we think about the recovery. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, profesor Marmot. Le damos entonces la palabra ahora a la doctora Kickbusch para que haga 5 minutos de comentarios y el cierre de su intervención. Muy amable.
Thank you very much, Eugenio. Just a few things. I think one of the issues I'd like to highlight is that we're going to see an increase in global inequality within and between countries. It's going to get even worse. And we're going to have a historic contraction of per capita income. At the same time, we're going to have an increasing clustering of wealth within, 1 or 2% of the global world's population, which is also related to the restructuring of our economies and societies, and something that had already started to happen with the digital transformation, etc., etc. which now has received that extra dynamic and push, at least in our part of the world, through COVID-19, and has led to, you know, even more profits and more development, and is actually pushing this new restructuring of society, which is going to leave many, many people behind. Significantly, we know that global GDP is falling. We know that most countries, most of the rich countries are going to have a loss of GDP of at least 7%, and the middle income countries probably around 3%, etc. And if you start, you know, calculating that, that's trillions and trillions and trillions of, you know, whatever currency you want to use. So I think one thing is important, that every country in slightly different ways is going to suffer from the impact. And as Michael has indicated, and as Eduardo has indicated, there are specific groups that are attacked both by the virus and by this brutal economic change that is coming. And frequently, as he rightly said, they do not have a choice. And therefore, I think the messaging around this virus as a great equalizer or something like that, you know, we say a virus knows no borders, but some people sort of give the impression a virus makes no difference whom it infects. Well, it depends on the environments and the vulnerability of people that they are infected. And I think our epidemiological message must also be adapted to that. That leads me to this notion of, you know, somebody asked about the criteria to assess health security. If you look at the present criteria, they are very, very technocratic and institutionally focused. You know, do you have a CDC? Do you have a pandemic plan? Do you have an international health regulations focal point, etc., etc.? They don't even really look how good your public health system is. They don't really look what the capacity of your country is in emergency medicine, which, you know, has been one of the great fears in this pandemic, and why some countries like Germany actually made the lockdown, because they were afraid that even the rich German health system wouldn't be able to cope with a large number of infected people and a large number of deaths. So we have to revisit these criteria with everything Michael has presented to us in mind. Unless we understand the interface between health security and social security, we are not going to be able to address this problem, because it is the most vulnerable that are going to be attacked, in quotes, by the virus. And if the societies do not have mechanisms to at least, you know, buffer that to a certain extent, think of, you know, suddenly we are seriously discussing at a global level a minimum income. We are taking seriously to say, you know, small and medium-sized businesses should get loans, or even, you know, not even loans, but basic amounts of money to be able to survive their business in order that the economy keeps going. So we're actually also looking at new economic models, and, you know, assessing health security is a multi-sectoral enterprise. It is not only assessing, you know, have you fulfilled your international health regulations obligations, as important as they are. And unless we get this new paradigm of health security that interfaces with social security, then next time round, the very same thing is going to happen. Black people, poor people, indigenous people, health workers, etc., are the ones that are going to die first and die in large numbers. And you know, many of the economies don't have the ability that the two countries I live in, Germany and Switzerland, they have suddenly found billions to distribute, you know, in furlough payments, in payments for industry, in all kinds of supports for restaurants, for cultural activities, you name it. Depends how long it goes, you know, sometime at one point this too is going to stop. But that interface is important. Just one more issue of a question that was raised also is the regional organizations, yes. Unless regional organizations, which have mainly been about economic affairs, understand the interface between economic and investment policies and pandemic preparedness and response, they are going to lose out. And we have seen how, again, I have to take the example from a group of economies, the European Union is going over its books and is trying, you know, has constructed an enormous new budget, has said, you know, we need to have stronger health cooperation, a stronger European Center for Disease Control, etc., etc. So I mentioned in my last slide, remember those middle powers? That includes regional organizations that need to come together and to ensure regional cooperation in terms of the interface of health security and social security. That, I think, has to be the key message. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, siendo ya la hora convenida, queremos agradecer mucho a los profesores Marmot, Kickbusch y Costa por sus excelentes presentaciones, comentarios, respuestas, todas las cuales van a ser sumamente útiles para que nuestro propio país pueda procesar sus propias lecciones y podamos salir adelante de este desafío. De manera que estoy muy agradecido a todos, la audiencia también, quienes nos han acompañado de varios países de la región de las Américas y del mundo, de manera que vamos a publicar también los videos para que quienes no pudieron seguirnos en esta oportunidad puedan posteriormente tener estas importantísimas contribuciones de los tres ponentes que hemos tenido esta mañana. De manera que de mi parte, muchas gracias y nos estamos viendo en cualquier momento.
Gracias, doctor Villar. Muchas gracias a los expositores de esta mañana, gracias a los participantes y los invitamos a acompañarnos en una nueva reunión de este 7º ciclo de conferencias que se llevará a cabo el próximo viernes 14 a las 10 de la mañana, evaluar las lecciones aprendidas por los sistemas europeos de salud. Gracias a todos y hasta el próximo viernes.
Luego.
Muchas gracias por la invitación de parte de la OPS, participado en habernos dado la oportunidad de participar en este evento. Y felicitamos nuevamente a Aspefam por esta actividad de haber permitido compartir las experiencias y las lecciones aprendidas a 6 meses de la pandemia y la respuesta de los servicios de salud. Muchísimas gracias.
Doctor Farfán, sus palabras de despedida.
Gracias, doctor Max Cárdenas. El agradecimiento al doctor Marmot y a los expositores, al doctor Eugenio Villar por su excelente conducción, y a usted, doctor Max Cárdenas, y a todo el equipo de la red por esta brillante participación el día de hoy y todo el equipo de apoyo. Muchísimas gracias a todos los participantes que nos acompañaron esta mañana y el próximo viernes estamos nuevamente con ustedes. Muchas gracias a todos.
Gracias. Terminamos la sesión despidiéndonos hasta el próximo viernes a las 10 de la mañana. Gracias a todos. Gracias, doctor Farfán.
A los espectadores, comunicarles que está en vista la encuesta para que puedan llenarla, que es muy importante para su asistencia y de este modo obtener la certificación luego de las 4 sesiones que corresponden a este ciclo. En el caso de los participantes que ya culminen con el llenado de la encuesta, ¿no? Ya pueden abandonar la sala. E invitamos también a los participantes que están en Facebook a ingresar al Zoom para que puedan culminar con la encuesta y de esta forma también obtener la asistencia correspondiente válida para la certificación al final de las asistencias del ciclo.
Gracias, Eduardo. Muchas gracias. Gracias, Eduardo.
Sí.
Oh, muchas gracias por tu participación.
Chao, Gustavo.
Chao. Y mira, qué lindo.
Sí, tengo el libro.
Cuídate
Gustavo.
mucho. Fuerte abrazo.
¿Cómo tú estás? ¿Está todo bien con ustedes?
Estamos bien, estamos bien. Sí.
Complicada nuestra situación.
Complicado también. Obrigado. Nos vemos pronto.
¿Cómo está ahí la vigilancia? ¿Cómo tú ves eso?
Bueno, está bien. Pedro está más directamente viendo ese tema. Pedro Riega.
Sí.
Sí.
Es bueno.
Vamos
porque...
a tener, a través de la red vamos a tener alguna interacción prontamente.
Sí, eu também penso que estaríamos. E conhecer melhor, porque quando se deram também, eu não tenho toda a certeza de que se passou. Por que Paraguai está tão bueno?
Uruguay.
Paraguai também.
Ah, también, sí. Vamos a hacer una conversación sobre ese tema en este mismo foro, Eduardo, en 2 semanas. El próximo viernes vamos a tratar Europa. Italia, España. Y el siguiente, el 7, 14, el 21, vamos a hacer América Latina. Y vamos a ver México, Uruguay, porque para comparar las diferencias.
Sí, eso es bueno.
Y teníamos también ahí Brasil, si no, vamos a conversar.
Sí.
Te voy a escribir un correo, ¿eh?
Sí,
¿Te parece? Un correo.
Y no tenemos ahí también la fuerza de lo... Es más complicado trabajar con o WhatsApp, pero algunas veces el punto para mí, bueno, tú sabes que fue un poquito ahí de última hora que hubo esa decisión de sustituir hermano. Y ahí también la cuestión de la lengua es complicada.
Claro.
La lengua es complicada. Sí. Pero yo voy a hacer una sumarización de esto que pretendía, na verdade, ter sido claro que você se foi, e aí mando para você. Os pontos que penso que nós temos que trabalhar a partir desta charla, porque ao mesmo tempo que os outros foram muito bons, muito preparados, não? Tu sabes que Michael Marmot e eu trabalhamos juntos, né, por um bom tempo. Ficamos muito amigos de família e tudo isso. Pero es muy distante de nosotros aquella realidad, ¿no? De Inglaterra, muy distante.
Sí, claro, es muy distante.
No tenemos ni...
Por eso... Sí.
Nós temos que trabalhar ao solo território, ver como hacemos esto. Y ahí con gobiernos de ustedes mejor que el nuestro, pero menos esto.
Sí, hay muchas cosas que a mí yo lamento mucho como un país que tiene tanta inteligencia en la salud pública, tiene un gobierno, un poder ejecutivo que conduce tan desastrosamente todo, ¿no? Y nosotros tenemos por ejemplo, un gobierno que está haciendo las cosas bien, pero una sociedad que no puede responder adecuadamente a eso. No solamente el sistema, es también el colectivo de las personas. Esto que
Sim,
se
é
dijo, el
uma coisa
70%.
reflete a outra, né? Aqui eu penso que exatamente é uma coisa que nós nos distanciamos também dos problemas mais básicos. Se formou um pouco de uma elite de saúde pública, digamos, que é mais general e conceptual, pero não é verdade que isso se passa em la punta, não? É diferente.
Claro.
Quando chegamos aí. Bueno, pues ahí vamos.
Ahí vamos, Eduardo. Un fuerte abrazo.
Otro.
Cuídate mucho. Te escribo.
Te puedo escribir. Deixa eu ver
Ok.
Não tenho muita certeza como está a água daqui.
Cerrar, salir, abajo.
Salir ahora.
Salir ahora. Mari.
Sí, doctor.
Ok, Mari, te llamo por el WhatsApp. Un abrazo. Salvo,
Gracias, doctor. Minutos de cerrar la sala. En la sala, por favor, les agradecemos llenar la encuesta. Estamos a 2 minutos de cerrar la sala y los invitamos al siguiente ciclo, que sería el día 14 de agosto a las 10 de la mañana. estimados participantes, le pedimos terminar el llenado de la encuesta en una pantalla y también cerraríamos la sala. Muchas gracias por su participación.